Hi everyone, this video is going to be about glazing, and we're going to practice glazing on your negative space studies from before. So what is glazing? Glazing is a transparent layer of color. You're adding medium to thin it down. You're keeping the layers really thin. Now, there's a couple of things we need to keep in mind as we start to glaze. So first, in order for it to be a glaze, it needs to be transparent for the most part. So we want to make sure that the pigment or the color that we're choosing is a transparent color. So in a glaze, you're doing this transparent color, you're letting the value structure you've already established in the painting, in this case in black and white, that's coming through. The glaze is just adding color on top of that value structure you already established. So it needs to be transparent for that to actually happen. If it's opaque or not see-through, then it's going to cover what you've already painted, and then you'll be really sad. So I just know what colors are transparent and opaque for the most part. I have a bunch of them memorized now. So alizarin crimson is one example, but the way that you check is just you go to the back of your paint tube and it's going to tell you if it's transparent or if it's opaque. So it's going to be right, can't quite see it, it's getting blown out, but if you just look at the back of your paint tube, you'll see that. It's, in this case with this Gamblin 1980 paint, it's just spelled right out. Sometimes different tubes will have a little box. So if it's a little box with a white clear center, then it's going to be transparent. But if it's a box that's solid black, then it will be opaque. So you can check that. You can always check your paint tubes, see if they're opaque or see if they're transparent, and then you'll go for the transparent colors for your glazes. Another thing we need to keep in mind is that, as always, we're putting solvent-free gel or a painting medium onto our palette. This is going to help make your paint more fluid. This is especially important for glazes where we want it to be going on smooth, and we're thinning our paint down with the solvent-free gel as well. Okay, so that is the color, the solvent-free gel. I also, throughout this process, you'll see me both when I'm showing you what the paint looks like on the palette, and then also as I'm painting the painting, you'll see me using two brushes. One brush is my kind of primary brush for getting the pigment on there, and then I used another brush, my big flat brush, to go over the surface and smooth it out and make it kind of meld into the painting. Now I used my filbert brush to put the pigment on, and then my flat brush to soften things and smooth out the glaze. You don't have to do that, but it is nice to have the two brushes, one the primary brush for putting on the pigment, another to smooth it out. Make sure your brushes are clean and that especially that they don't have any white. White is very opaque and it's going to mess up your glaze if it gets in there. Okay, so next up you'll see what the glaze looks like on your palette, what it should be looking like. Then after that will be a short demo on glazing and also a time lapse of the finished glaze. All right, enjoy. Let's talk about how to glaze and what that's going to look like on your palette. So in a moment I'll transition to the actual canvas, but for now let's take a look at our palette and what the paint will look like on your palette. So first you want to make sure you have some of your Gamblin solvent-free gel, the medium. We're going to be adding that into our paint definitely to make it more fluid, because we're going for these transparent layers. That's going to help us get that fluidity that we need and the transparency. And then I have alizarin crimson, I have ultramarine blue, and I have phthalo green. So you could decide to just glaze with one color, that's fine. But I chose these colors because they're all transparent. So you need to choose transparent colors. It will say if it's transparent on the back of the paint tube. So, and I have two brushes. This is the brush that I'm applying the glaze with. I've already glazed a bit so you can see some of the color on my brushes. And then this is the brush that I've been smoothing the glaze out with. So what you're going to do is you grab some pigment, but you're not going to go straight onto the canvas from like pigment to canvas. That's going to be way too much paint. So instead what you're going to do is get that pigment and you're going to add some medium to it, and you're going to kind of thin it out on your palette before you go on to the painting. So it should look kind of like that. And you can see its transparency, right? You can see the white coming through it. If this color was opaque, so if it was not transparent, you wouldn't see that white of the palette paper shining through. Okay, let me show you on just one more color. I also have a paper towel handy. You're going to need that as you change colors, or if there's too much paint on your brush, you want to have that readily available. Okay, and the glaze should be going on, it should be feeling smooth, and the solvent-free gel is going to be essential for that. So you're doing these really thin layers of transparent color. So you're not going for super right out of the tube, coating thick paint on there. Instead, we're going to be building, you can build up many layers of thin transparent color, and that's how you'll get it more intense. Okay, so make sure you have your solvent-free gel out, you're adding that into it, you're doing these thin transparent layers, and you're thinning it out on your palette before you go to the canvas. Okay, let's get into what glazing looks like. I have two brushes I'm going to be using. Whatever brushes you use, make sure they are clean, that there is no white especially in the brush at all. A glaze is a transparent, a very thin transparent layer of color, and so the pigment you're choosing needs to be transparent, and you're applying it very thinly. So you're letting the value structure you've established here still express that value structure. You're just kind of changing the color. So if you have white in that, for example, white is opaque, so it's not see-through. So it's going to start to cover the value structure you've already established, and it's going to conflict with your glaze. Okay, so let's start to, so first what I'm doing is I am evening it out on my palette, which you have seen. And now I'm going to start to apply it to the surface. And I'm taking medium and adding medium into my paint to make it more fluid. Now the reason I have another brush is to also go over the surface and to smooth it out. Okay, so a glaze, the idea with a glaze again is that it is a thin, transparent layer of paint. It's not meant to add texture, so that's why I'm kind of taking my other brush, which isn't loaded up with paint, and I'm smoothing it out. So I'm just adding this very thin layer of this phthalo green. So I'm going to be going in with two brushes throughout this entire process. But again, the glaze is a thin layer. You're just adding this transparent color. You're not trying to add texture. You're not trying to make super dramatic changes in the value. Rather, you're letting the value structure that you established in your black and white painting come through. Okay. So, and I'm also I can see right now that there's a texture that I don't like in this glaze layer. So I'm going in with my brush and I'm grazing over it kind of softly and quickly, and I'm changing the direction of my brush strokes as well, and that is going to help smooth it out. So it's this kind of dabbing motion, it's fast, and I'm going kind of softly across the surface. So we're trying to get that glaze to kind of meld down into the surface. Okay. And let's do a little bit of another color as well. So in whatever colors you're choosing for your glaze, you want to make sure they're transparent. And you can check that by looking at the back of your paint tube. It will tell you, so it will say transparent, semi-transparent, opaque, or semi-opaque, but you always kind of want to check that before you're using that pigment so that you have that awareness. You wouldn't really want to be trying to glaze with an opaque pigment, for example, because it's not going to be see-through, and it's going to start to cover your other layers of value that you've established. So that's just something to keep in mind. But phthalo green is transparent. Ultramarine blue is also transparent. Okay. So this is going to be our first kind of practicing with this process on this negative space piece. And we'll go deeper into glazing with our simple object still lifes once they are dry. But this will be a nice piece to practice this on. Now you can see the colors also quite light. Now with glazes, you want to keep them thin, very thin and transparent, but if you want to build up more richness in the color, you can just build up more layers of glazing. So that can take patience, where you glaze a layer, let it dry, come back to it when it's dry again, and then glaze more color and kind of build up more and more color that way. That also kind of leads me to another important point. Whatever painting you want to glaze, it needs to be totally dry. So these sections that I'm glazing, for example, dry, even the black is dry, okay? Your painting needs to be dry before you attempt to glaze. If you try to glaze onto something that is still wet or tacky, your glazing layer can start to meld with the layers underneath. And so, for example, the white would be permeating these colors and changing the color, or the black would, definitely change the color. So you want to make sure that whatever you're glazing, that it is fully dry before you're attempting to do your glaze. Otherwise, it's not going to be a glaze. That paint is going to melt together. Okay, let's also smooth that back out and smooth this out. Alright, now we'll transition into a time lapse where you can see me glaze the rest of this piece, and then we'll talk about it at the end. It is important to smooth out your glaze as you go. Because you are applying relatively thin layers of paint, the paint is going to dry pretty quickly. The paint needs to be smoothed out before it dries. Dab the paint on with one brush and smooth it out with another brush. Once you have covered an area in a glaze and smoothed out the paint, let that area dry completely before attempting to glaze again. Rich colors are built up through many layers. Remember to keep your layers thin and transparent. Here's the finished glazing example. And eventually we will be applying this technique of glazing color into our simple object still lifes.